As I stared at the footage on my screen, my hand began to shake uncontrollably. The grainy, hazy images from the security cameras didn't sugarcoat anything. In the dim corner of that nightclub was my wife, and she wasn't alone. Getting my hands on this footage hadn't been cheap, but the cost of uncovering the truth was turning out to be far higher than I had ever imagined. That cursed Christmas party marked the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. Though deep down, I had suspected something was off. I remembered watching Lori get ready for the party that night. She was so meticulous, paying attention to every detail. She had picked out a dress and stood in front of the mirror, inspecting herself, going over every inch of her look as though she were preparing for something far beyond a simple work gathering. Her makeup had to be perfect, and she even tried a new perfume, as if she were looking forward to something special. I felt a strange uneasiness settle in, but I pushed it aside. I didn't want to believe what I was feeling. Lori worked as an account manager at a finance company, and the company had rented out a nightclub for their annual holiday party just before Christmas. A party with colleagues sounded innocent enough. A chance to relax and unwind before the holiday break. I never had a reason to feel suspicious. After all, our marriage was solid. At least that's what I thought. Sure, I didn't know her co-workers that well, but it never seemed important. Lori always kept her work life separate, and I respected that. So that night, I stayed home with our daughter. We put up the Christmas tree, played a few board games, and after I tucked her into bed, I settled down with a book. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until hours passed and Lori still wasn't back. I decided to call her just to check in. The music on her end was so loud, I could barely hear her voice. She casually told me the party was still going on and she'd be home later, but there was something in her tone, a strange distance, that set me on edge. When she finally came home, it wasn't until the next evening and everything about her seemed off. Her hair was tangled. She smelled of booze and her eyes looked exhausted. All night, I asked where she had been, and all she could offer was a vague excuse about drinking too much and crashing at a friend's place. No details, no real explanation, just a quick apology and an awkward silence that left a bad taste in my mouth. She slipped off to the bathroom to shower, tossing her clothes in the laundry basket. And that's when it hit me, a strange urge to check her things, something I had never done before. Once the bathroom door shut, I found myself over at the basket going through what she had worn. There was a black dress she had been so particular about, her bra, but one thing was missing, her panties. I went through everything again, but they were nowhere to be found. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a glaring sign that something was horribly wrong. When she came out of the bathroom with her hair wrapped in a towel, looking relaxed, I decided to ask about the party. I kept my tone casual, trying not to sound like I was prying. "So, how was it?" I asked, though my mind was spinning. She barely looked at me and muttered, "Oh, these work things. Lots of drinking, silly games, a couple of contests. I guess I got a little too into it." She mentioned spending the night at her friend Sandra's place, who lived closer to the club. Her words sounded too smooth, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced this line for me. I knew she wasn't telling me everything, but I didn't press her. Confronting her now would probably just make her defensive, and I'd end up with nothing. No, I needed a different approach. The club's name was fresh in my mind from our brief conversation. That was my lead. I would go there myself and see what I could uncover. The next day, I took a day off work without letting Lori know. Being a real estate agent gave me some flexibility in my schedule, so it wasn't hard to arrange. I drove down to the club, feeling a mix of dread and determination, bracing myself for whatever I might find. I parked outside, took a deep breath, and went inside. I introduced myself as a real estate specialist and quickly spun a story about scouting the property for a potential client. It wasn't my best lie, but it was convincing enough for the staff to buy it, and they gave me a polite, if slightly skeptical, tour of the club. As we walked through, I noticed the security cameras mounted around the club, their lenses angled to capture nearly every inch of the interior. If those cameras had been recording during the party, they might hold the truth of that night. The big question was, how could I get access to the footage? After the tour, I thanked the administrator, who still seemed a bit uncertain about my intentions, and walked back out to the parking lot. As I stood there considering my options, someone brushed past me, snapping me back to reality. "Watch where you're going," they muttered, but I barely registered it. I had only one thought on my mind. I needed that footage. The man snapped at me again, clearly annoyed, and I was just about to apologize when I froze. That voice, I recognized it. Looking up, I realized I had walked straight into Felix, an old friend from college. "Felix? It's me, Russell," I called out, trying to cover my surprise with some enthusiasm. Felix's irritated expression softened into one of surprise. "Russell, man, it's been 10, maybe 12 years. How are you?" We exchanged the usual catch-up lines, but inside, my mind was racing. Felix working here was an unexpected stroke of luck. "So you're working at this club?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," he said with a shrug. "I'm a manager here. Not exactly where I thought I'd end up after college, but it pays the bills." He laughed, but I could hear a bit of frustration in his tone. This was a chance I couldn't let slip. "Hey, how about a coffee? There's a cafe across the street," I suggested, keeping my voice steady, though I was eager to get to the point. He glanced at his watch. "I've got a break in half an hour. Meet you there?" "Perfect." I nodded, managing a smile. I headed over to the cafe, my mind racing. If I played this right, this could be my chance to get the footage I needed. I ordered a coffee and sat down, my nerves on edge as I waited. When Felix finally arrived, he looked tired and worn down, like life hadn't been kind to him. We eased into some small talk, catching up on where our lives have led. Felix had been through a lot. His mother's illness had drained his savings with medical bills, and he'd struggled to keep up, hopping from one job to another until he ended up managing things at this club. But his role wasn't exactly what it seemed. "I'm a manager, sure," he said with a weak smile. "But it's more like I'm in charge of the cleaning crew and maintenance. Just making sure the place doesn't fall apart." He chuckled, but I could tell it hurt. Back in college, Felix had been sharp and ambitious. A guy with big dreams. Now he was stuck managing the club's grunt work. "Man, you were always one of the brightest back in school," I said, trying to remind him of the potential he had. "Figured you'd be doing something big by now." "Yeah, well, life's got a way of messing up your plans. These days, I'm just doing what I can to keep afloat." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I hadn't come here just to catch up. I needed something from him, and I didn't have all day. After a few more minutes, I decided it was time to lay it out. "Look, Felix, I'm not just here for old time's sake. I actually need your help with something," I said, lowering my voice as I leaned forward. "It's about that Christmas party. My wife, Lori, was there, and I think she wasn't completely honest about what happened." He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What are you trying to say?" I took a deep breath, feeling a heavy knot in my stomach. "I think she might have cheated on me. I need to see the footage from that night. The security cameras. I need to know the truth." Felix's face immediately shifted, a mix of surprise and unease. "Russell, I don't know. First off, I wasn't even working that night. And even if I was accessing that footage without clearance, that's serious business. If I get caught, I lose this job. I can't afford that right now." I could see the struggle on his face. Felix was a good guy, and I knew what I was asking was risky. But I couldn't just walk away without knowing. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious. "You know me. This isn't like me. But this is my marriage. I need to know what happened. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But if I'm right, I can't live like this, questioning everything." Felix leaned back, visibly uncomfortable. "I get it, Russell. I do. But you're asking me to put everything on the line. This job may not be glamorous, but it's all I've got right now. They're strict about security here, and if I get caught, I'll be out on the street." I paused, thinking, and then an idea came to me. "What if I made it worth your while?" Felix frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and placed dollar in cash on the table. Felix's eyes widened as he shifted between me and the money, looking torn. "Look, I'm not asking you to do this for free," I said, keeping my voice low. "I know it's risky. This is for your trouble. And if you get me that footage, there's another $1 in it for you." I paused, gauging his reaction. "And it's not just about the money. I've got connections. Felix, you don't belong here, running the night shift and managing the cleaning staff. You're better than this. I know people in real estate tech finance. I can help you find something better." He rubbed his face, clearly battling with the decision. I could tell the cash was tempting, and the thought of a better job might have felt like a way out of the rut he was stuck in. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't want to risk it, didn't want to lose the one steady thing he had. Russell, man, I don't know. I really don't. Felix muttered, rubbing his face in frustration. Deep sigh. If I get caught, I can't afford to lose this job. My mom's counting on me. I get it, Felix. I really do. I replied, keeping my voice steady. But I promise you won't get caught. I'll make sure of it. And once this is over, I'll help you get out of this dead-end job. This could be a new beginning for you. Felix sat there in silence, staring down at the cash. His expression torn between the fear of risking his job and the hope of a way out. After a long pause, he finally nodded, though he didn't look completely convinced. All right, I'll do it, he said. But Russell, if anything goes south, I'm out. You got that? Of course, I said. Nothing will go wrong. And when it's done, I'll make sure you have something better lined up. You have my word. We finished our coffee, and Felix told me he'd need a few days to figure out how to get the footage without raising suspicion. We exchanged numbers, and I promised him the rest of the money once he had the recordings in hand. As we parted ways outside the cafe, I watched him head back toward the club, feeling a mix of guilt and hope. I knew I was asking a lot, but I was desperate for answers. Now all I could do was wait, but waiting didn't sit right with me. So I decided to start helping Felix with his job search immediately. It had been too long since we'd last spoken, and I felt a pang of guilt knowing he'd been struggling all this time. It wasn't just about the footage anymore, it was about helping a good guy find a way out. I made a few calls to contacts in various industries, reaching out to people I trusted. Thankfully, a couple of them came back with solid leads, and I knew I could help Felix get a fresh start. A few days passed, and life went on as usual. Lori acted like everything was normal. Calm, cheerful, showing no signs of suspecting anything. I followed her lead, locking my suspicions away, but the uneasiness gnawed at me constantly. Then one afternoon I got a message from Felix. He wanted to meet. He had something for me. We met at a different cafe, a bit further out to avoid any familiar faces. When I arrived, Felix was already seated, looking both anxious and a little excited. As I sat down, he leaned in, lowering his voice. Here, he said, sliding a small flash drive across the table. Everything's on there. I downloaded the recordings from the entire night of the party. I picked up the drive, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Did you see anything? I asked, my heart thumping. Felix looked down, fidgeting. The cameras don't cover the whole club. There are a few blind spots where people could slip away if they wanted to, but I got everything the cameras captured. He looked around nervously. No one's noticed yet, but if they do, it could come back to me. I knew the risk he was taking, and it wasn't a small one. This wasn't just a favor. It was a huge leap of trust. I pulled out the rest of the cash, but Felix hesitated, not reaching for it. Russell, I don't know if I should. I didn't do this for the money. Take it, Felix, I insisted, pushing the cash toward him. You earned it. And listen, you don't have to be afraid of getting caught. Quit the place. I've already lined up some meetings for you. There are people ready to talk about better opportunities. His eyes lit up, the worry in them easing just a bit. I nodded. You've got options now. You don't need to stay in that rut. Felix finally took the money, slipping it into his jacket. Thanks, Russell. I don't know what to say. Just take care of yourself, all right? I said, patting his shoulder. You got a future to think about. Don't let that place drag you down. We parted ways, promising to stay in touch. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, like a stone. Yet, despite the temptation to dive into it right away, I held back. I knew I needed a moment to brace myself for whatever I was about to find. The next day, I waited until Lori left to run errands. As soon as she was out the door, I sat down at the kitchen table, laptop open, flash drive in hand. I inserted it into the USB port. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, feeling my heart race. Then finally, I took a deep breath and hit play. The footage showed the party in full swing. Music blaring, lights flashing, and people all around laughing, drinking, and dancing. I saw Lori looking stunning in that dress, chatting with her coworkers, laughing, and seeming to have a great time. For a while, it all looked perfectly innocent. But what began as a night of lighthearted dancing and drinking quickly morphed into something. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Lori's colleagues, these so-called professionals, seemed to be acting out a chaotic scene straight out of The Wolf of Wall Street. There wasn't anything outright illegal, but the atmosphere had nosedived from festive to something disturbingly wild. The alcohol had peeled away their professional masks, and before long, the corporate holiday party turned into something far darker. As the contest became more suggestive, the room filled with laughter and shouts, and the games they played grew increasingly unhinged. The camera captured snippets of people taking body shots, adding each other onto behavior that would have been scandalous anywhere, let alone at a work function. And then I saw Lori. She wasn't just dancing or mingling anymore. She was completely uninhibited. Swaying recklessly with a drink in hand, she wrapped her arms around people, men and women alike, as if there were no boundaries. My pulse quickened as I leaned in, watching her cling to some guy I'd never seen before, pulling him close. They drifted through the crowd, heading toward the back of the club, right to an area where the cameras couldn't see clearly. But before they slipped out of view, I saw enough, pressing her lips against his in a way that left no doubt it wasn't a casual peck. She kissed him deeply, without hesitation, her body pressed against his hands grabbing at her without shame. I could hardly breathe. This wasn't harmless party flotation. This was something vile, a complete betrayal. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, another man joined them. I watched as Lori laughed, wrapping her arms around him too. Their bodies tangled in some alcohol-fueled display that made my skin crawl. The three of them became a mess of limbs and drunken recklessness, moving toward the club's shadowy corners where the cameras didn't reach. I stared at the empty frame on my screen, knowing all too well what was happening just beyond view. Minutes later, they reappeared, stumbling back into view. She fidgeted with her clothes, attempting to smooth them out as though that would somehow erase what she had just done. The two men with her were grinning, adjusting their own clothes. One of them had a pair of red lace panties sticking out of his pocket. Her panties. That was the final, undeniable proof of what had happened. The next morning, I called a lawyer who specialized in high-conflict divorces. I told him everything, what I'd seen on the footage, every detail of Lori's betrayal, and my concern about protecting Felix from any fallout. He listened carefully, nodding as I spoke, and assured me we could use the video without exposing Felix. Once the paperwork was in order, we would move forward with the divorce and Lori wouldn't have any ground to stand on. About a week later, I got an unexpected call from Felix. "Hey, Russell," he greeted, and I could hear excitement in his voice. "Just wanted to thank you, man. That recommendation you gave me. It worked. I got a new job, better pay, better hours. I couldn't have done it without you. Felix, that's amazing. I'm really happy for you. You deserve this." I said, truly glad for him. I couldn't have done it without you, man. At least some good had come out of this mess. But just as the pieces of my own plan started falling into place, life threw me another curveball. One afternoon, while Lori was out, I noticed her purse lying on the counter. I don't know what compelled me to look inside, but curiosity pulled me closer. Peeking in, I found a folded piece of paper. Against my better judgment, I took it out. It was a doctor's report. Test results. Lori had tested positive for an STD. While not life-threatening, the implications hit hard. Not only had she been unfaithful, but she'd been reckless enough to keep this from me. I snapped a photo of the report, placed it carefully back, and stood there as a mix of anger and determination surged through me. I couldn't just let this go quietly. This wasn't going to be a clean, simple divorce anymore. I needed to act. After Lori went to bed, I made my move. I took her phone and started searching through her messages. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Photos from that night, images of her with the men I'd seen on the footage, pictures she'd been careless enough to keep. I took note of their names and dug a bit deeper, quickly finding out where they lived. At first, all I wanted to do was drive over and confront them, but then a better idea took shape in my mind. Rather than going after them directly, I decided to take another approach, one that would hurt even more. I tracked down the wives of the men Lori had been with and carefully reached out, arranging to meet each of them in person. When we met, I told them everything, the truth about the party, the infidelity, and the potential risks their husbands had exposed them to. I showed them the pictures to back up my story. Their reactions were exactly what I expected: shock, rage, and disbelief. They were devastated. I suggested they contact my lawyer if they wanted to prepare for the fallout. With that in motion, it was finally time to confront Lori. One evening, I waited for her to come home from work, sitting at the kitchen table with the divorce papers neatly laid out in front of me. When she walked in, I handed them to her in silence, immediately sensing something was wrong. "I know everything, Lori," I replied. "The nightclub, the men, I know what you did." Her hands shook as she flipped through the papers. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, trying to hold herself together. "This is crazy, Russell. You're making things up." I kept my voice steady, unfazed. "I saw it all," I said. "I have the footage, Lori. I watched everything from that night." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face as she tried to speak. But I cut her off. "And I know about the doctor's visit," I added, pulling out my phone and showing her the photo of the test results. "You kept this from me, and I'm done." Her defenses crumbled, and she tried to explain, rambling on about how it was a mistake, how she'd been drunk and hadn't known what she was doing. But I wasn't buying it. I'd seen too much to fall for her excuses. I slid the divorce papers across the table. "You're going to sign these without a fight. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone in your life knows exactly what you did. I'll show them the footage, the test results, everything." Lori's expression shifted to anger, but she knew she had no power left. "You bastard," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. But I simply stood up, feeling calm and resolute for the first time in weeks. "Sign the papers, Lori," I said, walking out of the kitchen. "We're done." When the divorce process began, my lawyer took charge with careful precision, ensuring everything was handled cleanly and discreetly. He used the video evidence strategically, keeping Felix's name and involvement clear from any fallout. By then, Felix had moved on to a better job, leaving his connection to that nightclub far behind. As for Lori, she was defenseless in court with the evidence stacked against her. Everything proceeded smoothly, but there was one unexpected hiccup. One of the men from the party, Juan, wasn't handling things well. Apparently, the fallout from his affair with Lori had come crashing down on him, wrecking his own marriage. One evening, well into the legal process, he showed up near my house. At first I didn't see him, but he was waiting, simmering with anger. When he finally confronted me, he accused me of ruining his life. I looked him in the eye and shook my head. "Juan, you did this to yourself," I said, turning to leave. But then he lunged at me, throwing a punch. Maybe he thought he'd take me by surprise, but he didn't know I'd been training in boxing for years. I had him on the ground, out cold. It wasn't even a fight, just a desperate, pointless swing from someone unwilling to face his own choices. I didn't feel any satisfaction, only a deep, quiet pity. And that was it. The divorce went through, and I got full custody of my daughter. We divided our assets, and Lori faced the consequences of her choices. Finally, I was free. A few weeks later, Felix invited me to his birthday gathering. It was a small celebration, just a few good people. To my surprise, I met someone there. She was kind and had a spark that I hadn't felt in a long time. We connected instantly. Standing there talking and laughing with her, I felt something I hadn't in months. A sense that life could be bright again. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to be okay.